And Andrew, the question is, and this is something the opposition leader's been targeting this afternoon, is that correspondence that we reported yesterday where the former sports minister contacted the Prime Minister on the eve of the election to detail what grants she was intending to improve. Why is that important?
Well, it's important for a couple of reasons, but in terms of why she did that, Kieran, I think there are two possible explanations. One is that she wanted to run the grants past the Prime Minister. He kind of pours cold water on that. The other reason, perhaps given it's by letter, is to implicate the Prime Minister, that she saw that it was a pretty politically biased grants program and she wanted to ensure he had some ownership of it as well. Let's take you through this and why the government is now under pressure to explain whether the third round of sports grants in the sports rorts affair were actually legal. So, as we revealed yesterday, answers to the Senate inquiry from the Audit Office revealed that Bridget McKenzie, the former sports minister, wrote to Prime Minister one day before the election was called on April 10 last year, detailing what grants were going to which electorates and held by which parties. The next day, the day the PM called the election, she passed on her brief approving the grants to Sport Australia. So the Audit Office says on the 10th of April 2019, the Minister wrote to the Prime Minister attaching printouts of two worksheets within the spreadsheet, and they go on to say that on the 11th of April, the list of projects she intended to approve for round 3 funding and the worksheet with the summary tables were what was sent to the PM. The whole box and dice on grants which were found to differ 76% from what her department recommended just a week earlier. And then on April the 11th, if we can see that, the signed approval brief dated 4th of April 2019, we'll get on this in a minute, but it was dated a week earlier, was provided to Sport Australia by the Minister's office with an attached printout. So that was provided on the day the election was called, and we discovered this morning from the Senate inquiry into the sports rorts affair that was 17 minutes after the caretaker period occurred, after the parliament was prorogued, and there was no authority for the government to make such a decision or approval. Let's hear what the Senate inquiry heard this morning.
So in relation to when we received the advice for round 3, it was 8:46 a.m. on the 11th of April.
Right.
Via email.
From
the Minister's office.
When was the Parliament dissolved on that day? Are you aware of that?
No, Senator.
I'm of the understanding it's at 8:30 a.m. or about that time. So if you received it at 8:46 a.m, we're actually in caretaker at that point in time. Were you aware of that?
No, Senator, I wasn't aware of that.
Now, Andrew, as we mentioned, you mentioned a bit earlier, that brief was dated April 4. It wasn't submitted for another week. Why is that?
Well, that's a $64 million question, I guess. I mean, the Audit Office pointed out that brief was dated April 4 when it was signed by Ms McKenzie, and we heard the Prime Minister refer repeatedly to that in question time in terms of trying to establish the legality of the grants, I guess. Sport Australia had given its recommendations, Kieran, to the Minister on the grants it wanted approved on April 3. This very diverse proposal of grants, 76% differed from the Sport Australia proposal, was supposedly signed off on April 4. Certainly the date is the April 4 that she signed it, but it wasn't submitted to Sport Australia till April 11. We know that from the Auditor General. One argument put to me this morning was that McKenzie would have signed the document on April 4, but she was on the road and did not hand it in till a week later. So let's have a look at Bridget McKenzie's travel arrangements at that time, because I've looked them up. She was in Canberra on April 4. There is no reason why Bridget McKenzie, Kieran, could not have signed that document, and it could not have been submitted to Sport Australia on that day. We know it was not submitted on that day. When it is actually submitted, April 11, if we can move through her travel dates, she is in Sydney, where the Commonwealth parliamentary offices are. When she writes to the Prime Minister, she's in Sydney. When she submits it to Sport Australia and the election is called, she is in Sydney, but she was in Canberra on April 4. So it's very hard to accept that she signed this document on April 4. Perhaps she took it away with her, signed it while she was on the road, and then submitted it, but because it was prepared by her staffers, it still had the April 4 date there. I think she kind of owes it to the Senate to appear at this inquiry and explain herself.
Well, as you point out, on the 4th of April, as her travel log suggests, she was in Canberra. So there's a question right there, as you've asked this afternoon. I think it's a pertinent one, given where this timeline is at and given it was so close to the election. If it was signed on April 4, why not submit it, given you're in the nation's capital? You could have submitted it to the Sports Commission. But as it turned out, it
could have hand-delivered it.
It was dated April 4.
Yeah.
6 days later it went to the Prime Minister. 7 days later it went to the Sports Commission. Certainly some explanation would be welcome, wouldn't it?
Look, it looks fishy, and frankly it looks like it was signed after the date in question. And, you know, the opposition, I think, would argue, well, she got the Prime Minister's approval first on April 10 before she submitted it. I don't think there's evidence to suggest that at the moment. That's just an inference. It's more likely, in a sense, she took it away with her and only had the document to submit a week later.
Let's just put up those travel dates again, though, if we can, from the 5th of April, because I think this is important. When you look at the fact that on the 4th of April, the former Sports Minister was in Canberra. So if that letter is dated the 4th of April, it was signed in Canberra, why then is it taken to Melbourne, to Adelaide, to Albury, to Sydney, to Perth, that document, and then it gets to the Prime Minister on the 10th?
Well, it's well put. I mean, what are the chances she signed it on April 4 and took it away and then submitted it a week later? Or what are the chances she signed it on April 4, left it in the office, and then it was submitted a week later? We know she's in Canberra on April 4.
Well, there could be an explanation, but let's hear it.
I emailed Bridget McKenzie. I haven't had a response. Obviously, the Senate want to call her. We'll see if that occurs.
The Senate committee is going to call her. We know that. They've extended, I was told before question time, Andrew, that the Senate committee looking into the sports rorts, it was due to report back in March. It's now been extended to June. It could be extended further. So in a political sense, the pressure will remain on the government over this issue. It remains a political headache for as long as the crossbench will support Labor in that endeavour. And one of the things they're going to do, well, first of all, after next week's sitting week, they'll be holding hearings in Melbourne and Adelaide to meet with the clubs that missed out. So there's that component of the story. And then the week after, they're going to request Senator McKenzie to appear. And the question is, will she or won't she? Apparently, she can't be compelled to appear before that committee, but geez, it'd be a bad look if she rejected their request.
Well, I think she would reject their request unless there was some mechanism in which she was perhaps forced to appear, but I'm told she can't be compelled to appear.
So even if the Senate itself voted to say you should appear, she doesn't have to. But if she didn't and she defied the Senate, that would be a bad look in a political sense, wouldn't it?
Well, I think that's something that could compel her.
Huge pressure on her.
I think that is something that could compel her, even if in just a political sense. Because I think it's fair to say the Prime Minister's office, the government wouldn't want her to appear. And so she would want to do what they wanted, but she'd still be dirty about the fact she had to resign her commission. So if the Senate voted to compel her to appear, the Senator may say, well, there's nothing much I can do. The Senate are compelling me to appear. So that's a fascinating thing to watch over the next week or two. Either way, it's a big story,
the
whether she
Labor
appears
leader,
or not.
for his part, Anthony Albanese, trying to ping the Prime Minister for as much involvement as he can. Have a look.
The Prime Minister has claimed his only involvement in the corrupt sports rort scheme was passing along information. Why then, on the day before he called the election, did the Prime Minister obtain a colour-coded spreadsheet from Senator McKenzie with projects she intended to approve, listed by party and electorate?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would refer the member simply to the evidence provided today that Sport Australia advised the committee this morning that they received a brief from Senator McKenzie dated 4 April 2019 approving the third round of the community sports infrastructure grants.
And as you saw there, the Prime Minister had a form of words, a written form of words, and he stuck to it right throughout the afternoon.
How could the Minister's decision have been made on 4th April if Senator McKenzie sought the agreement of the Prime Minister and his office on the 10th of April?
The Prime Minister is not the decision-maker in relation to the program that he has suggested. As I've said on numerous occasions, the ministerial authority for these decisions was the Minister for Sport. The Minister for Sport, Mr Speaker, authorised those arrangements, and that authorisation is dated the 4th of April 2019.
Doesn't this directly contradict the Sport Australia evidence today in the Senate that this advice was provided at 8:46 a.m. on the day the Parliament called the election?
I repeat what I said earlier. Sport Australia advised the committee this morning that they received a brief from Senator McKenzie that was dated the 4th of April 2019.
Why was the brief approving the projects backdated by the government by a week to 4th of April?
He's been completely untruthful. The brief from Senator McKenzie that actually gives the authority for the approval of these projects, Sport Australia confirmed, was dated the 4th of April 2019.
So, Andrew, the Prime Minister repeatedly pointing to the fact that brief was dated the 4th of April. It was something he went back to time and time again to say this was a week before the election was called.
Well, it might have been dated April 4, Kieran, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't signed April 4, and I'd like Senator McKenzie to show us, to prove to the public that it was signed on April 4, because all the evidence points to the contrary. Why on earth is it only going on April 11 to Sport Australia if it was signed on April 4? So that puts it in play in terms of these grants potentially being illegal. Tens of millions of dollars worth of grants.